The view from the 52nd floor of the Sterling Tower was flawless, a grid of golden light stretching across Manhattan, but the reflection in the window told a different story. Julian adjusted his tuxedo tie, catching the gaze of his wife, Elena, in the glass. She was smiling at a donor, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Yet her eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely distant. Somewhere in his pocket, a burner phone vibrated with a message that could shatter this crystal cage into a million irreparable shards. If the fragile beauty of a life built on secrets intrigues you, stay with me. We are just beginning to see where the cracks form. The morning light in the Sterling penthouse didn't filter in. It assaulted. It cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master bedroom, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the chrome fixtures, turning the room into a beautiful, overexposed photograph. Julian Sterling lay still in the king-sized bed, listening to the rhythm of his wife's mourning, the clack, clack, clack of Elena's heels on the hardwood in the hallway, the distinct whir of the espresso machine in the kitchen, the silence that followed. It was a choreography they had perfected over 10 years of marriage, a dance of proximity without contact. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Today was the preliminary review for Vetro, the 70-story glass needle that was supposed to be his magnum opus. It was the building that would etch the name Sterling into the bedrock of Manhattan forever. When he walked into the kitchen, Elena was already dressed. She wore a charcoal pencil skirt and a silk blouse that looked as soft as water, but was likely as expensive as a small car. She didn't look up from her tablet. "The PR team wants a quote for the press release by noon," Elena said, her voice smooth, professional. She swiped across the screen, her manicured nail making a sharp tapping sound. Something about transparency, about bringing the light into the domestic sphere. Julian poured himself a black coffee, leaning against the island. "Transparency, right?" "Don't use that tone, Julian," she said, finally glancing up. Her eyes were a piercing blue, intelligent and unyielding. "We're selling a lifestyle, not just square footage. The investors are nervous about the zoning permits in Chelsea. They need to believe in the vision." "I am the vision, Elena," he muttered, taking a sip. The coffee was bitter. "You're the architect," she corrected gently, walking over to him. She reached out, not to touch his face, but to straighten his collar. "I'm the one who makes sure people pay for it. Don't forget that." She kissed his cheek, a dry, rehearsed press of lips, and grabbed her purse. "Dinner at the Whitneys tonight, 8 p.m. Don't be late." And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the silent, immaculate apartment that felt less like a home and more like a showroom. The offices of Sterling and Vance Architects were a chaotic contrast to the penthouse. The air buzzed with the sound of plotters printing blueprints, phones ringing, and the low hum of 50 designers arguing over load-bearing walls. Julian marched toward his corner office, his mind already dissecting the structural issues of the Vetro atrium, when he stopped. In the open-plan studio, at a desk cluttered with sketches and soil samples, a young woman was arguing with the lead engineer. "You can't just put concrete planters there," she said, her voice firm but melodic. "The light refraction from the glass curtain wall will scorch the ferns in an hour. It needs to be a suspension system, hydroponic." The engineer, a man Julian had employed for 15 years, looked annoyed. "We don't have the budget for a custom hydroponic rig, Sophia." "Then we change the budget," she insisted, brushing a strand of unruly brown hair out of her eyes. "Mr. Sterling wants a living building." "Dead plants aren't living." Julian stepped closer. He hadn't hired Sophia directly. HR had brought her on as a junior landscape associate 3 months ago. He had seen her file, top of her class, brilliant portfolio, but raw. "She's right," Julian said. The conversation stopped. The engineer straightened up. Sophia turned, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the CEO standing there. She wasn't polished like Elena. Her blouse was slightly wrinkled, and there was a smudge of graphite on her cheek. "Mr. Sterling," the engineer stammered, The cost of failure is higher," Julian said, his eyes locking on Sophia's. "Walk me through the suspension idea." Sophia hesitated for only a second before grabbing a piece of trace paper. She began to sketch, her hand moving with a fluidity and passion that mesmerized him. As she explained the integration of nature and structure, Julian felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't just attraction, though she was undeniably striking in an understated way. It was recognition. She spoke about the building not as an asset or a PR stunt, but as art. She spoke the language he used to speak before he started worrying about zoning permits in dinner parties at the Whitneys. "It's risky," Sophia said, looking up at him, her breathing slightly elevated. "But it would be beautiful." Julian looked at the graphite smudge on her face. He had an overwhelming urge to reach out and wipe it away. "Let's draft it," Julian said, his voice lower than intended. "Bring your sketches to my office. We'll work through lunch." As he walked away, he felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket. A text from Elena. Reminder. "Wear the navy suit tonight. Matches my dress." Julian didn't reply. He just opened the door to his office and held it open for Sophia. The city outside the 52nd floor was a blur of rain and neon, but inside the conference room of Sterling and Vance, the world had shrunk down to the size of a drafting table. It was 8:15 p.m. Julian was supposed to be at the Whitney Gala 15 minutes ago. His phone, placed face down on the mahogany table, had buzzed repeatedly for the last hour before finally falling silent. He knew exactly what the silence meant. Elena had stopped calling and started planning his punishment. But for the first time in a decade, he didn't care. "If we angle the suspension cables here," Sophia said, her finger tracing a line across the blueprints, "we can use the tension to support the walkway without blocking the skylight. It's like the building is breathing." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with the kind of raw, unadulterated enthusiasm that Julian had thought was extinct in this industry. There was no calculation in her gaze, no assessment of cost per square foot, just pure creation. Julian leaned in closer, the scent of her, rainwater and cheap vanilla coffee filling his senses. It was a stark departure from Elena's scent, which always smelled like cold orchids and expensive perfume. "It works," Julian murmured, studying the drawing. "It actually works. I haven't seen a solution this elegant since I was in grad school." Sophia flushed, a genuine color rising in her cheeks. She looked down, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I studied your early sketches, you know. The ones from before you started Sterling and Vance? The glass garden concept in Chicago? That was why I became an architect." The mention of that project, a failure commercially, but a triumph artistically, struck Julian in the chest. "Elena hated that project," he said, the words slipping out before he could check them. "She said it was self-indulgent." "It was honest," Sophia countered softly. She looked him dead in the eye. "It was the last time you designed something for yourself, wasn't it?" The room went very quiet. The hum of the HVAC system seemed to fade away. Julian felt stripped bare. Elena managed his life, his clothes, his schedule, and his public image. But Sophia had just walked right into the private museum of his regrets and turned on the lights. He should leave. He should grab his jacket, run down to the limo waiting in the garage, and concoct a lie about a crisis with the city inspectors. Elena would be furious, but she would accept a business excuse. Instead, Julian reached out and picked up a pencil. His hand brushed against Sophia's. She didn't pull away. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that had nothing to do with static. For a lingering second, neither of them moved. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken things. "I'm not going to the dinner," Julian said, his voice rough. Sophia glanced at his phone, then back to him. "Your wife." "My wife is married to the building," Julian said, turning back to the blueprint. "And tonight, so am I." He picked up his phone and typed a text to Elena. "Emergency structural issue with the atrium. Can't leave. Make my apologies." He hit send. It was a lie. There was no structural emergency with the building, only with the man designing it. Sophia watched him, her expression unreadable, perhaps sensing the weight of the line he had just crossed. She didn't ask him to leave. She simply picked up her eraser and cleared a space on the paper. "Okay," she whispered, "then let's fix the atrium." They worked until midnight. Outside, the rain lashed against the glass. But inside, Julian Sterling was building a new world, brick by brick, oblivious to the fact that he was simultaneously dismantling his old one. The construction elevator rattled violently as it ascended the spine of the Vetro Tower. It was nearly midnight, 3 weeks after the night they had redesigned the atrium, and the building was a skeletal beast of steel and concrete, cold and unforgiving against the wind. Julian stood next to Sophia, their shoulders brushing with every jolt of the lift. They were technically there to inspect the glazing on the 42nd floor, a supposed defect in the glass transparency that Julian had invented to get them out of the office. When the cage ground to a halt, they stepped out onto the unfinished floor. The city of New York sprawled below them, a grid of electricity and ambition, but up here, exposed to the elements where the glass walls hadn't yet been installed, it felt like the edge of the world. The specs were right, Sophia said, her voice fighting the wind. She walked toward the precipice, her coat flapping around her legs. There's no defect, Julian. You knew that. Julian didn't answer. He watched her silhouette against the city lights. For weeks, they had danced around this precipice with late-night coffees, lingering glances, and conversations that went deeper than he had gone with anyone in years. He felt a desperate, starving hunger that had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with being seen. He walked up behind her. I just wanted to see it, he said, his voice low. With you. Sophia turned. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She didn't step back. The intellectual barrier they had maintained, the mentor and protege facade, crumbled instantly. This is dangerous, she whispered, though she wasn't talking about the drop. I know, Julian said. He reached out, his hand gripping the back of her neck. The skin was warm, alive. When he kissed her, it wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It was the release of 10 years of suffocation. There was a taste of dust and concrete in the air, gritty and real, so unlike the sterile, hermetically sealed environment of his penthouse. For a few minutes, in the shadow of the empire he was building, Julian Sterling forgot who he was. He forgot the contracts, the investors, and the woman waiting for him in the sky. The cab ride back to the Upper East Side was a blur of guilt and adrenaline. Julian checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He straightened his tie, smoothed his hair, and checked his collar for lipstick. He looked the same. He looked like the CEO of Sterling and Vance. But when he keyed into the penthouse, the silence felt different. It was heavy, judgmental. He walked into the master suite, expecting Elena to be asleep. She wasn't. Elena was sitting at her vanity, removing her makeup with precise clinical strokes. She watched him enter through the mirror, her expression perfectly neutral. You're late, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a timestamp. Site inspection, Julian lied, the words tasting like ash. The glazing on the 42nd floor. We had to verify the UV coating before the morning crew starts. He started to unbutton his shirt, turning away from her to hide his hands, which were shaking slightly. Elena stopped moving. She held a cotton pad suspended in midair. Funny, she said softly. I checked the project logs online. The site manager signed out at 6 p.m. Who unlocked the gate for you? Julian froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had forgotten that Elena had administrative access to the project management software. She tracked everything. Costs, timelines, personnel. I have the master key, Elena, he said, forcing a casual tone. I don't need the site manager to hold my hand. Elena turned on her stool to face him. Her eyes swept over him, analyzing him like a flawed blueprint. She didn't look at his tie or his collar. She looked at his shoes. They were covered in a fine layer of gray concrete dust. Dust that wouldn't be found in a finished office. You have dust on your Ferragamos, she observed. I told you, I was at the site. Yes, Elena said, standing up. She walked past him toward the bathroom, pausing just inches from his shoulder. She didn't touch him, but he could feel the chill radiating off her. She inhaled slightly, a microscopic sniff. She smelled the wind, the grit, and perhaps the faint, sweet scent of vanilla coffee that wasn't hers. Go shower, Julian, she said, her voice dropping a degree. You smell like labor. She closed the bathroom door behind her. Julian stood alone in the bedroom, the adrenaline turning into cold dread. She didn't know who, and she didn't know what, but she knew. The inspection had begun. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the Sterling penthouse was brittle, like a violin string wound to the snapping point. Julian sat at the marble dining table, attempting to read the Wall Street Journal, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone. He was waiting for a signal from Sophia, a confirmation for their lunch meeting at a tucked-away bistro in the West Village. Elena was seated opposite him, an iPad propped up against a crystal water pitcher. She wasn't eating, she was scrolling. The sound of her finger swiping against the glass was the only noise in the room. The quarterly expense audit came in from the accountant, Elena said, not looking up. Her voice was light, conversational, the tone she used when discussing weather or charity galas. Julian turned a page of the newspaper, feigning disinterest. And? We're within budget. Mostly, Elena agreed. She took a sip of her tea. There is one oddity. The corporate Uber account shows a ride originating from Brooklyn Heights at 3:15 a.m. on Tuesday. That was the night of your site inspection. Julian's heart skipped a beat, a physical thud against his ribs. He had been careful. He had walked 3 blocks from Sophia's apartment before calling the car, but he hadn't calculated the timestamp. I dropped a consultant off, Julian said, his voice steady. He had practiced this lie in the shower. One of the structural engineers lives out there. It was late. I wanted to make sure he got home. Elena stopped scrolling. She looked up. Her face was a mask of porcelain perfection, but her eyes were surgical. They dissected him. You took a car to Brooklyn to drop off an employee, then came back to Manhattan? That's very generous of you, Julian. I didn't know you were so involved in the personal welfare of the staff. The project is demanding, Elena. People are exhausted. Yes, she said softly. Exhaustion makes people make mistakes. She tapped the screen, closing the file. She didn't push further. She didn't ask for the name of the engineer. She didn't need to. The lie was plausible, but it was weak. Elena didn't deal in weak things. I've been thinking, she continued, standing up and smoothing her skirt. You're carrying too much weight. If the team is this overworked, perhaps I should step in. The interior design elements, the lobby, the atrium gardens, those fall under the aesthetic umbrella. That's my domain. Julian lowered the newspaper. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. You're busy with the foundation, Elena. You don't have time for site visits. I'll make time, she said, walking around the table. She stopped behind his chair, placing her hands on his shoulders. Her grip was firm, possessive. I want to see where our money's going. I'll be coming to the office this afternoon. I'd like to meet the team responsible for the atrium. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. I want to meet everyone, Julian. I want to see exactly who is keeping you up so late. She pulled away before he could respond, picking up her purse. Cancel your lunch. We'll dine together near the office. I've already updated your calendar. Julian watched her walk to the private elevator. He waited until the doors slid shut before grabbing his phone. His hands were trembling. He opened his message thread with Sophia and typed 3 words, feeling the walls of his glass empire closing in. She is coming. The storm hit Manhattan at 5 p.m. a freak Atlantic squall that turned the city gray and violent. By 5:30 p.m., the main drainage valve on the Vetro construction site had failed. Julian stood ankle-deep in muddy water in the sub-basement, shouting over the roar of industrial pumps. The water was rising dangerously close to the main electrical junction for the entire tower. If the water hit the breakers, the timeline would be set back months and millions of dollars would vanish in a shower of sparks. We need more sandbags on the north perimeter, Julian yelled at the foreman, wiping rain and grime from his eyes. His tuxedo trousers, he had changed in the office, fully intending to leave, were ruined, splattered with mud up to the knees. His phone, sealed in a waterproof case in his breast pocket, vibrated against his chest. It was a relentless, rhythmic buzzing. Bzzt, bzzt, bzzt. He didn't need to look to know who it was. It was 7:15 p.m. The Whitney Gala red carpet had just opened. Elena would be standing. There, in a gown of silver silk, waiting for the husband who was the centerpiece of her arm. Julian! He turned. Sophia was running toward him, carrying a heavy canvas sack of sand. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her skull, her expensive architectural blouse ruined. She didn't look elegant. She looked magnificent. The retaining wall is holding, she shouted, dropping the bag onto the levee they were frantically building. But we need to divert the flow to the auxiliary drain. I have the schematics. She didn't ask him why he was there. She didn't ask about the gala. She just grabbed a shovel. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in the freezing muck. There was no romance in it, only the raw, visceral survival of the thing they had built together. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline that no boardroom deal had ever given him. He wasn't the CEO. He was a builder, and Sophia was the only one who understood that the building was more than an asset class. It was a living thing that needed saving. By 9:30 p.m., the pumps caught up. The water level began to recede. The crisis was contained. Julian leaned back against a cold concrete pillar, his chest heaving. He slid down until he was sitting on the damp floor. Sophia sat next to him, equally exhausted, her hands scraped and dirty. "We saved it," she breathed, a small, tired smile touching her lips. Julian looked at her. In the harsh glare of the work lights, covered in mud, she was the most real thing he had ever seen. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers laced with his, tight and desperate. "Thank you," he said. Then the reality rushed back in. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up the dim basement. 42 missed calls, 15 messages. He opened the last text from Elena, sent 20 minutes ago. "The dinner's over. The donors asked where you were. I told them you were unwell. Do not come home tonight, Julian. I don't want to. See you." There was no anger in the text, no exclamation points, just a flat, terrifying finality. Julian looked at Sophia, who was watching him with concern. He realized then that he hadn't just missed a party. He had humiliated Elena in front of the very people she ruled. He had broken the cardinal rule of their arrangement. Never embarrass the family. He turned off the phone. The screen went black. "Is everything okay?" Sophia asked softly. "No," Julian said, staring into the dark water swirling at his feet. "I think the storm is just starting." The invitation had arrived on heavy cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the Sterling family crest. It wasn't an email. It was a summons. A private dinner to celebrate the team who saved Vetro. Intimate attire, 8 hours p.m. Julian had tried to stop it. He had told Elena that Sophia was busy, that she was shy, that it was inappropriate to mix staff with their private lives. Elena had simply smiled, adjusting the pearls at her throat, and said, "Nonsense. She saved your legacy, Julian. I want to thank her personally." Now the dining room of the penthouse felt less like a place of sustenance and more like an operating theater. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a light so sharp it seemed to sterilize the air. Elena sat at the head of the long ebony table. Julian sat on her right. Sophia sat on her left. The spacing was deliberate. Elena was the judge, and they were the defendants. "The architecture of this apartment is breathtaking," Sophia said, her voice slightly shaky. She looked out of place in a simple black dress that she had likely bought specifically for tonight. It was tasteful, but against Elena's vintage Dior, it looked threadbare. "Julian designed it," Elena said, cutting a piece of rare steak with surgical precision. "He wanted walls of glass so that nothing could be hidden. He believes that light disinfects." She paused, placing a piece of meat in her mouth. "Do you agree, Sophia? Do you think transparency is always a virtue?" Sophia hesitated, sensing a trap but unable to see the mechanism. I think honesty is necessary in design. You can't lie about gravity." "No," Elena purred. "You certainly can't. Gravity always wins in the end. Things that climb too high without a proper foundation, they always come crashing down." Julian took a long swallow of wine. It tasted like vinegar. He couldn't look at Sophia. He stared at his reflection in the polished black table. Every sound, the clink of silver on china, the pour of the wine, was amplified. "Julian tells me you're quite the visionary," Elena continued, signaling the server to refill Sophia's glass. "He says you see things he can't. That must be intoxicating for him. He's been bored for such a long time." "He's a brilliant architect," Sophia said, glancing at Julian for support. He gave a microscopic shake of his head. "Don't engage." "He is," Elena agreed. "But he's a terrible maintenance man. He likes to build new things, shiny things. But when the cracks appear, when the weather gets rough," she smiled, a cold, dazzling expression that didn't reach her eyes, He leaves the cleanup to me. I'm the one who reinforces the steel. I'm the one who ensures the investment is protected. She turned her gaze fully on Sophia. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tell me, Sophia, in landscaping, what do you do with a plant that is beautiful, vibrant, but invasive? A species that threatens the root system of the established garden? Sophia went pale. The metaphor was not subtle. It was a blade pressed against her throat. Sophia stammered. I suppose you transplant it. No, Elena corrected softly. You cut it out at the root, before it chokes the life out of the things that actually matter. She picked up her wine glass, holding it by the delicate stem. But let's not talk about gardening. Let's talk about the future. I've been reviewing the staffing contracts for the next phase of Vitro. I'm thinking of making some changes. Restructuring. Julian's head snapped up. Elena, we can't. I'm speaking to our guest, Julian. She silenced him without looking away from Sophia. New York is such a difficult city for young artists. So expensive. So unforgiving. I'd hate to see someone with potential get crushed by it because they overreached. Elena raised her glass. To boundaries, she proposed, her voice soft as silk wrapping a brick. And knowing where they lie. Sophia didn't drink. Her hand was trembling too hard to lift the glass. Julian sat frozen, watching his wife destroy the woman he loved without raising her voice above a whisper. He realized then that he wasn't the master of this house. He was just another tenant. An eviction was imminent. The grand opening of Vitro was a masterpiece of optics. 700 feet above the streets. Of Manhattan, the city's elite mingled in a space that felt like it was floating in the clouds. Champagne flowed like water, and the flashbulbs of the press photographers created a strobe light effect against the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Julian moved through the crowd like a ghost. He shook hands. He smiled. He accepted compliments on his vision, but his eyes were darting frantically, scanning every face. Sophia wasn't there. She hadn't answered his calls for 2 days. Her desk at the office had been cleared out. Not just organized, but erased. No sketches, no soil samples, no trace that she had ever existed. He found Elena standing by the north wall, looking out at the skyline. She wore a dress of crushed velvet, the color of midnight, and she looked like a queen surveying a conquered kingdom. Where is she? Julian asked, his voice low but vibrating with fury. He didn't care who heard him. Elena turned slowly, sipping her champagne. You'll have to be more specific, darling. There are so many people here to celebrate your success. You know who? Sophia. She's gone. HR said she resigned effectively, immediately. What did you do? Elena's smile didn't waver. She gestured toward the open elevator. Not here, Julian. We don't wash our dirty linens in front of the investors. Upstairs. They took the private lift to the 71st floor, the unfinished penthouse. It was a cavernous space of raw concrete and glass, silent and cold, far removed from the warmth of the party below. As the doors closed, Julian snapped. Did you pay her off? Did you threaten her? I didn't have to do anything, Elena said, her voice echoing in the empty space. She walked to the edge of the room, her heels clicking on the concrete. I simply explained the reality of the situation to her. I told her that if she stayed in New York, she would find it very difficult to find work. The architectural world is small, Julian, and my family's reach is very long. You blacklisted her, Julian spat. You destroyed her career because of your jealousy. Jealousy? Elena laughed, a dry, brittle sound. This isn't about jealousy, Julian. It's about asset protection. She was a liability. She was distracting you. Look at you. You're a mess. You're ready to throw away a legacy for a girl who likes plants. I love her, Julian said. The words hung in the air, naked and terrifying. Elena's face hardened. The mask finally slipped, revealing the steel beneath. Love, she repeated with disdain. Love doesn't pay for the mortgage on this tower, Julian. Love doesn't secure zoning permits. I do. I'm leaving you, Julian said, stepping forward. He felt a sudden manic sense of freedom. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the firm. I'm done being your puppet. I'm filing for divorce in the morning. He turned to leave. But Elena's voice stopped him cold. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact. Read your partnership agreement again, Julian. He stopped. The Sterling and Vance firm, Elena said, walking slowly toward him. It's structured as a holding company. The majority shareholder isn't you. It's the trust, my family's trust. You are the face, the talent, the name on the door, but you own nothing. The patents, the designs, the vitro brand, even the deed to this building. It's all mine. She stopped inches from him, looking up into his eyes with a terrifying calmness. If you walk out that door, you leave with the clothes on your back. You won't be Julian Sterling, the visionary architect. You'll be a bankrupt middle-aged man with a scandal attached to his name. And Sophia, do you think she'll stick around for that? Do you think she loves you, or the man who could build her dreams? Julian stared at her. The glass walls around him suddenly felt like the walls of a fishbowl. He looked down at the city lights, millions of them, shining bright, and realized he couldn't touch a single one. You can't keep me here, he whispered. I don't have to, Elena said, turning back to the elevator. You'll stay because you're a coward, Julian. You love the view too much to live on the ground. She pressed the call button. Fix your tie, she said without looking back. The photographers are waiting. 6 months later, the winter snow had turned New York into a grayscale etching, but inside the Vetro Tower, it was eternal spring. The atrium was finished. It was a marvel of engineering, a lush, vertical jungle suspended 3 stories above the lobby floor. The ferns were thriving, the orchids were blooming, and the custom hydroponic system hummed with a quiet, efficient rhythm. Julian stood on the mezzanine, looking down at the garden. It was exactly as Sophia had sketched it on that rainy night. Every cable, every angle, every shadow was hers. Mr. Sterling? He turned. A young assistant, fresh out of Columbia, was holding a tablet. The photographer from Architectural Digest is ready for the portrait session. They want you in the center of the atrium. The lighting is perfect. I'll be there in a minute, Julian said. His voice sounded hollow to his own ears, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. He looked back at the garden. He had tried to call Sophia 3 days after the gala. The number was disconnected. He had driven past her apartment in Brooklyn. There was a for rent sign in the window. She hadn't just left the firm. She had erased herself from the city. She had understood the threat Elena posed better than he had. Julian touched the cold steel of the railing. He was the most celebrated architect in America. Vetro was fully leased. The critics called it a masterpiece of transparency. But he knew the truth. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a mausoleum, a beautiful glass tomb for the man he could have been. That evening, the penthouse was quiet. The silence was different now. It wasn't the tense silence of secrets. It was the settled, heavy silence of a treaty signed in blood. Elena was in the living room, reviewing the guest list for the next charity ball. She looked up as he entered, offering him a small, polite smile. It was the smile of a jailer who treats a well-behaved prisoner with kindness. The article looks wonderful, she said, tapping the magazine on the coffee table. They called you a modern visionary. They did, Julian said. He poured himself a drink. Scotch, neat. He drank it like medicine. I was thinking, Elena continued, her voice light, we should take a trip in the spring. Tuscany. The villa needs some renovations. I think you'd enjoy the project. Something small, manageable. She was giving him a task, a hobby. Keep the architect busy so he doesn't break anything else. Julian walked to the window. The city sprawled out before him, a sea of lights. He could see his reflection in the glass, the tuxedo, the graying temples, the tired eyes. He looked successful. He looked powerful. But he couldn't see past the reflection. The glass was too thick, too perfect. Julian? Elena called out softly. Did you hear me? He didn't turn around. He placed his hand against the cold pane, feeling the vibration of the wind outside, a wind he could no longer feel on his skin. Yes, Julian said to the glass. Tuscany sounds fine. He took another sip of the scotch, watching the lights of New York blur together. He had built an empire of glass, designed to let the light in. But as he stood there, trapped in the sky, he realized that glass doesn't just let light in. It keeps the air out. And for the rest of his life, Julian Sterling would just be watching the world breathe.